So thank you, everybody, first of all, for joining. And I'm here to talk about Tupelo and also a new product that we have launched recently called dGit, which is a decentralized Git. So my name is Topper Bowers, and I am the CEO of Quorum Control, and we are the entity that's building Tupelo, which is a open source and permissionless network purpose-built for all of those use cases that are not decentralized finance. So all of the real-world use cases, using real-world loosely, because also like digital assets and that kind of thing. It's a proof-of-stake network, and it has a lot of features purpose-built for application builders and all of these use cases that we were originally told blockchain was going to be amazing for, and then the reality set in when we were trying to hit actually build these things. I often find that understanding Tupelo helps if you hear the origin story. So I'll make this quick though, which is that back in 2016, I was trying to build an information security company. And I was trying to anchor some corporate compliance rules with a public blockchain. And I tried Bitcoin, I tried Ethereum, I tried a whole bunch of esoteric ones like Nano and stuff like that. And just realized that none of those public systems were actually going to work for my use case, which was a simple application anchoring stuff to a blockchain. So I kind of gave up on using the public blockchains at the time. And about a year later, though, I had this idea that if you actually inverted how blockchains were built, you could end up with a system that really worked for the real world use cases. And what I mean by inverting how they are built is that right now, all public systems, at least all the ones that I've heard of, start with this concept of money exchange at the very bottom, all of them. And I think it's an accident of history because Bitcoin came first, that all of them start with this concept here. We're going to have value exchange, money exchange, token exchange as the very base layer of the system. That's what the system does. Now, other systems have started to layer on top of that and build the world's computer by building smart contracts on top of that token exchange. And then your real world applications end up being on top of those smart contracts with logical objects living on top of those smart contracts. So to build this real world application, you're talking about getting tokens, deploying smart contracts, and then interacting on chain with these smart contracts. When in reality, the reverse is much better for the use cases of stuff like supply chain tracking, things like CryptoKitties, things like NFT ownership of stocks, anything that has this concept of individual object. Everyone is repeating the same smart contracts over and over again, which is here's this object, there's an owner of the object, and here's some data about the object. And so what Tupelo does is it takes that concept and puts that in the very base layer of the system. And the objects, ownership, and data are what Tupelo is all about. And then we do actually layer tokens in on top. But the purpose of Tupelo is not actually those tokens. They're just a useful concept for things like collective ownership or authenticating an individual chain tree of origin, those kind of things. So what Tupelo does that's very different is it has a completely different data structure than other blockchains. It has a new data structure that we came up with called a chain tree. And what a chain tree is a combination of a blockchain of updates, so to an object, and a tree of current state. And for the nerds like me out there, with all of this is content addressable. What that really means, though, is that this root node up here, this green one that you see on the slide, it can be hashed, and if you hash that root node, then you get then you can represent the entire object, including the history of the object. So what Tupelo does that's very different is rather than having a single blockchain, which is all the transactions that ever happened on the entire system, Tupelo takes sharding to the nth degree and creates a blockchain per object. So every single individual thing in the world or the modeled system has this chain tree or an individual object associated with it. So, I like to say, like, you get a chain tree and you get a chain tree and you get a chain tree. It's right. It's like, so my identity might have a chain tree. My CryptoKitty might have a chain tree. Its ancestors are different chain trees. This idea is that every single thing keeps track of its own updates and its own current state. And so the other big difference with Tupelo is that we separate trust from storage. And this is because we found that a lot of companies and builders were moving to private systems from public ones because of the public nature of the data. And so what Tupelo says is, okay, so data storage is actually an application level concern, but we'll make the way you access all that data standardized into the system. So everyone's working with the same way to get data, but where it lives can be application specific. And so when I say application specific, I mean is that sometimes, three corporates interacting in a what would usually be a private blockchain or consortium system can actually use the public network. And what they do is they then share the data off chain amongst only themselves. Another use case might be something that really needs a censorship resistant, publicly untamperable storage system. Something like a dissident, something like a petition, dissident petition. And so for that permissionless storage, maybe you go to something like Arweave, which it actually is a blockchain, which will keep that and make it permissionless. So every application has very different storage needs, from the dissident petition all the way down to two companies interacting, but they can all benefit from the security and interoperability of a public system. And it turns out that if you do all that, you end up getting this system that just works better for public systems, for rural systems. You don't have to do total ordering because money is not the primary concept here, which allows your consensus algorithm to be easier. You're not concerned about all these different transactions having to be put into the correct order and the state being different depending on what order. Each individual object has its own state, and so you can do a much easier computer science-y, consensus algorithm to get all those things, to get everything on chain. That also allows the signers to do a lot less work. They don't have to download 125 gigabytes of previous state in order to start approving transactions. They can come online and start approving because the individual owners of chain trees can pass back in the state that's needed to make those transactions happen. It also turns out that rather than rewriting the same contract over and over again, and there's my dog for the recording there as it ran by, hopefully everybody saw that. It turns out that rather than writing smart contracts in an esoteric language, you can take these contracts, which were being redone over and over again. Here's this object, here's some ownership of an object, and here's some data about that object. And instead, you just call into the system. It feels like you're using some sort of SaaS product or a centralized system, but instead you're using a scalable public permissionless network. So stuff like calling into the object and saying set data rather than deploying a smart contract and then interacting with that smart contract. And there's also some other really interesting things around lock-in. And this is something that one of our builders actually told us after we had already, started talking to them and had already built some of Tupelo. But the quote I actually often hear from them, which I should have on a slide here, but I don't, is that he says, if you can get everyone in the room to agree on a blockchain or on a set of technologies, then you don't need a blockchain, right? And that's a really powerful concept. Is like, if you can already get your businesses together to agree on a standardized format of things and work together, then you're best off just working with an API or a shared database. What blockchain allows is this kind of like, you can get started and start interacting in a trusted way without having to get all those parties in the room. And it turns out that's pretty powerful because most businesses, even big ones, can no longer dictate to their supply chains, and they have to work with smaller players, and they can't all say like, hey, hop on our private Hyperledger instance. So that partner, what was interesting was that they switched to a public network to avoid that. And then what they realized is that smart contracts actually have the exact same problem, which is that here's the smart contract that everyone has to go and agree on the data formats that are going to go in and out of that. The contract is published permissionless, and anyone can interact with it, or only the correct people can interact with it. But what that means, though, is that people get locked into these smart contracts, and someone has to maintain them, someone has to upgrade them. You end up with the exact same agreement problem that you had with a private network. It's just being run on a permissionless network. So what Tupelo does, though, is it lets you put data into these chain trees, which is the source of truth for an individual saying something about an object, which allows people to just get started and having trusted data into the system without agreement. And then over time, form the agreements on like, what's the formats, how should these things interact? And it just became it's this really powerful thing for businesses that want to start interacting with each other, is you don't have to get your whole consortium into a room and agree. You can actually have one party start pumping data in and building up this trusted history and start interacting with other objects and actually get the whole system rolling. It becomes this really powerful way for businesses to use a public blockchain without having to, to resort to the private systems that they used to have to use. And what I also want to use as kind of an illustration of this concept of digital ownership and use cases outside of the traditional, decentralized finance or, or just currency exchange, is that there's this whole class of applications that will really benefit from trust. And it's, I think it's Chris Dixon who said, trust is the best Lego. And the blockchain is providing this new Lego block for developers. And we just launched a project called dGit, which is decentralized Git. And so a lot of trolls will say, but Git is decentralized, and I think that's true, and that's kind of awesome about it. But then what happens is you start to have to layer in all these ownership and where is it going to be stored, what's the canonical repo, and what you end up with is everybody using GitHub. And I think this is illustrative of some of these use cases that maybe people thought blockchain was good for it at the beginning, but then became impractical to use. And what we realized at Tupelo is that Tupelo is amazing for taking other data and providing trust and ownership to it, and Git exactly had this problem, right? So I'll get into the details of how we do that in a second, but I think what's really interesting about this is that Git or Git repos, which source code repositories for projects, are this thing that is a digital asset. It has rules about its ownership, and is owned by different people. Also has things like licensing concerns and things like that. And what have we had to do in the past? We've had to rely on a third party, whether that's almost 99% on GitHub and 100% on GitLab or whatever the actual division is. And because it was impossible to do that in a sort of peer-to-peer fashion. And dGit and Tupelo proves that it is possible. And I think that's illustrative of a whole bunch of other things that you can do with trust. So what dGit does is when you do a normal Git push, which is what developers do when they want to push out their repos to the rest of the developer team, is that it uses Tupelo to say, hey, can this person push there? And it will update the actual canonical representation of the source code of the application being built. So that it will be the tree of ownership and references to the larger objects. And then the larger objects, which are text files, images, all that kind of stuff, gets put into Skynet, which is which I'll get to in a second. But so the way that, to illustrate that again one more time, is that a user gets their own chain tree, and that's an identity about who can push to a repository. And a repository also gets its own chain tree. And we also have the concept of organizations, which would also get their own chain tree. And users would belong to organizations, and chain tree and repositories belong to organizations. And Tupelo models all of the control and interactive ownership of those objects, and then the big things are pushed over to Skynet. So Skynet is part of SIA, and SIA is a decentralized storage system. It's incentivized storage. And I think, it goes back to application-specific storage that I talked about. Well, in dgit, the application-specific storage happens to be SIA. Now, it actually is pluggable, so you could actually use different decentralized systems if you wanted to, or even if you wanted to have something along the lines of GitHub Enterprise or something, you could actually keep that information within your own walls of an organization, but still use Tupelo as a public trust infrastructure that you didn't have to set up yourself. Skynet is a portal for those objects. So it's has some centralization in that there are individual portals that are run by different parties, but anyone can run a portal. So if you put information into one portal, it's available on all the other portals. And I talked about this a little bit already, where Git is this digital good that is not a currency, that is not decentralized finance, and yet has a lot of these same issues that are necessary when we talk about things like, CryptoKitties or something like that. It's like, which one is the real one? What is the canonical one, right? Git is amazing because you can fork it out, right, and have a million different versions of this thing. But like, which one is the one that you for your application? Also, do the right people update it, right? So if we're all keeping our information on GitHub, did the actual owners push those commits into the GitHub repository, or did a nefarious employee on GitHub do it? Now, that's saying, GitHub is generally awesome and has reputation risks, so I'm not saying that they're a bad place. It's just I think it's we all are embracing this decentralized censorship resistance thing, and then keeping all of our source code in an individual place that has already shown that it's censoring, right? It's already cut out GitHub repos from Iran and things like that too. And I also think that, like, usually when we talk about getting rid of the middleman, we talk about banks, but there's a whole bunch of applications that have to have this trusted middleman. And then sometimes sometimes it's just about getting rid of the digital infrastructure necessary for there. So we have a demo called Decentracar, which shows off doing like a Lyft or an Uber style thing using a decentralized network. And what's interesting about that one is that Lyft or Uber still remains as this trusted third party, but they save a whole bunch of money because they don't have to push all of the updates through a centralized server, and instead their trust can permeate the network and allow individuals to interact. And to me, that was the real power of blockchain, is letting trust be modeled as it should be. And instead of requiring a trusted third party to be providing that trust for really no reason except an accident that we didn't have the technology to do it, now we have the technology where we can model these systems in a way that makes sense for each one of the systems, and it's not all about currency. And there's a lot of like true open source people that get some pushback on DLT in general, and then especially when we're talking about what Git too, is like, well, you're in this post-scarcity environment where you have this digital world which is infinite. Why are you trying to bring scarcity back into it? And I think that what I always say to them is that that's the wrong question. The real question is about like, who's in control? And sometimes it should be one person, and sometimes it should be no one, or a collective of people. But it's about modeling these relationships between people in a digital way that we can all believe in. And that was, to me, what the most amazing thing about blockchain was that all of a sudden, our application, which we build in these identities in different ways over and over again in different applications. If I have trust in one place, I can't take that over to someplace else. Developers can't build new features on top of the old features. And what blockchain was enabling, in my mind, was this concept of allowing organizations to self-form to have digital trust, and to build out systems that ran without the permission of a government, without the permission of a bank, without the permission of GitHub, and building out, a system as they see fit. So I'd love you to give dgit a try. It's really easy. I just brew tap quorum control dgit, and then brew install dgit, and then dgit in it, and then you have a repo that is decentralized. And this is one of the things that we really go after hard at Tupelo, is to make sure that building a decentralized system isn't actually harder than building a centralized system. And I think you'll find with dgit, it's just as easy as using regular Git, right? It's just git add a remote and git push, and then you have a decentralized repo that's has the ownership modeled in Tupelo. I would love to hear more feedback. There's a ton of different directions that we can go with dgit as well, and so you can actually just go check them out either on our GitHub link or directly from dgit itself. And I would also, any questions about Tupelo, and you can find out how to build other amazing decentralized systems on Tupelo at docs.tupelo.org. You can find me on, you can find me on Twitter or Discord or Telegram. I'm Toe Bowers on all of those, and I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback. And thank you so much for listening.